Hi there. Tomorrow we start on Darwin, Charles Darwin. And this is, as I've said, I believe this is the heart of the class. And I would ask you to really pay attention to the reading for these weeks. I mean, all the reading is important, but there's something that's, I think, special about Darwin. For example, the whole notion of dark green religion that we talked about, that I introduced a week or two ago, couldn't really exist without this framework that Darwin gives us of the interconnection of life, the web of life, ecology, and then joy and wonder in life. And I think Darwin in some ways defines what I was talking about by this idea of dark green religion. And I'm asking you to read Darwin, not for a sense of was he right and correct scientifically, but rather for a sense of who he was as a thinker and how he's learning to value and see the natural world. Okay, that's in some ways I'm asking you to read Darwin as a theologian. What does he have to offer us with respect to insights into how to value and understand the natural world? That's what we're going to be reading for. We'll also talk about his theories and what he's seeing in the natural world, but that's where he has interest. And can we read him as a religious thinker? Can we think of his Origin of the Species, which we'll eventually get to, as something of a secular scripture? These are the questions I want to ask. And we're beginning with his Voyage of the Beagle. Now, a little bit, you're going to hear a lot about Darwin from me. I'll give a fuller view of his life story before too long. But Darwin lives from 1809 to 1882. All right, that's his lifespan. He is going to go on the Voyage of the Beagle. He's going to be enlisted in 1831, sign up for it, and then 1832 and then he'll return in 1836. So we got a full 4 years, right? Of voyaging, and he goes around the world. I'll post a map so you can see he literally circumnavigates the world. Now, this is not some kind of triumphant, senior scholar going around the world. This is a grad student, and that is something you have to remember while you're reading this. Darwin is 23 by the time he begins this voyage on the Beagle. He is a student of promise, a naturalist, but he's not someone who has any accomplishments under his belt. He is beginning on this, and he really finds his calling in the course of this voyage. All right. So today you would graduate from college, 21, maybe in 22, you're going to grad school. And then you have, it takes 6-7 years to get your PhD. Those are exactly the years that Darwin is on the Beagle. So remember that. And what you're getting in the Voyage of the Beagle is a book of Darwin's taking things in and thinking things through. Okay. And that's something to remember. Now, it reads much better than the notes and journals because Darwin has taken his notes and journals that he's made during this trip, and in the few years after he returns, he's worked them up into this book. So it feels much more thought through and settled than it does in his original notes and journals, which we have and you can see. But so there's a level of reflection on this material and naming species, for example. He's taking specimens and then he goes back and he has experts to look at them with him, and then they're identifying things, and that's making its way into the journal. So he has the benefit of hindsight in putting together this journal. But it's important to remember it's someone who's making sense and trying to see the world rather than someone who is going on a voyage and proving what they've already learned after a whole career doing something. So do your best to kind of read it with that in mind. You can see the composition of the book in various short sections. For example, on page 37, this is, if you have the textbook, I realize there may be some other versions of Voyage of the Beagle, but this kind of twofer, Everyman's Library has Voyage of the Beagle and Origin of the Species, and that'll be the page numbers I'm referring to. On page 37, chapter 2, he says, leaving the coast for a time, we again entered the forest. The trees were very lofty and remarkable compared with those of Europe from the whiteness of their trunks. I see by my notebook, wonderful and beautiful flowering parasites, end quote, invariably struck me as the most novel object in these grand scenes. There it's very clear. Darwin is composing this travel narrative as in someone in his late 20s, looking back on his rough journals and notes, and sometimes quoting from those rough journals and notes. So that is a point to remember as you're reading this. Now, the chapters I've selected, you're not reading this whole thing, but these are important chapters because of the light they throw on Darwin's view of human beings that he's seeing and passing. Okay, so for example, on page 39 and 40, this is also in chapter 2, he's going to talk about the slavery that he witnesses in Brazil. Now, it's important to know that Darwin comes from a famously anti-slavery family. They are steadfastly, that's like a huge issue for his family. So this is an anti-slavery family. At the same time, you're going to see him struggling with race and culture in many places. And here in Brazil is the opening version of that, where he is trying to understand what exactly he's seeing, and he responds with horror at the way slaves are being treated. Okay, he's even going to the Fitzroy is going to be the captain of this ship, and he's going to have a major falling out with Fitzroy over the question of slavery. Fitzroy, the captain, turns out to be staunchly in favor of slavery, and Darwin makes a pointed comment about that position, and then they end up not being able to speak to each other for a good length of time, right? So this is Darwin has passions about this, but it's at a time when there's a lot of argument about slavery. So that's the one thing. The chapters I've chosen are not just about the natural world. They're also giving views of how Darwin is kind of making sense of human beings. And are human beings animals? Are they, what separates human beings from the natural world? These are things you'll see him thinking through, and something I want to talk and discuss with you all. Now, we also see him taking joy and wonder in life. Also with chapter 2 on page 41, you see him saying, in England, any person fond of natural history enjoys in his walks a great advantage by always having something to attract his attention. But in these fertile climates, meaning in tropical Brazil, teeming with life, the attractions are so numerous that he is scarcely able to walk at all. In other words, you just see so many different plants and animals and insects that you can barely take a step without having your attention drawn to something and feeling like you can't continue on your walk. You have to stop and look at something. And these are the sort of moments I think you'll see throughout this book of wonder and attraction of life. Just a little bit later in that same chapter, he has this phrase that I love, talking again about the tropical forests of Brazil and all the different species of beetles that are out there. And he loves beetles. He says, it's sufficient to disturb the composure of an entomologist's mind to look forward to the future dimensions of a complete catalog. In other words, there's just such an abundance of beetles that it's just disturbs the composure of the mind, right? So you'll definitely get a sense as you're reading this that Darwin, this isn't some kind of dry job that Darwin is doing, but it's something that he loves and stirs up his passions as he's out there. Now, you'll also see Darwin, he brings a number of books along with him. And one of those books is Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology. And it's Lyell is going to be the one who really pushes geology away from a short span creationist view of the world and towards just massive ages of time that would have been necessary to pile up, limestone and sedimentary layers. And so you get this, all of a sudden, Darwin is going to be looking at life, but now being able to imagine it with this huge span of time that you can play with and think about how life existed in those spans of time. You'll see him in chapter 5 thinking about fossils and making reference to Lyell. So that's a kind of if you think about Darwin as the kind of secular prophet for the dark green religion, you could maybe think of Charles Lyell as sort of a John the Baptist figure in that. And Darwin, more so than Wilson, is going to be engaged with geology and trying to think about geology. One of the famous chapters we'll get to is Darwin in Chile, and he's going to experience an earthquake and see the changes that have been brought to the landscape, right? So Darwin is very much a geological thinker. That's the setting for understanding this long scope of life that he wants to talk about. Eventually, he's also going to get to the Galapagos Island. And if there's a sacred space of the dark green religion, I would argue that it's the Galapagos Islands, where on reflection, he's going to come to see that the creatures that he encounters there and the differences between the turtles and the finches can only be explained by kind of microevolution, that divergent evolution that's happening on these different islands. So that's going to be an important chapter that we'll eventually get to in the Voyage of the Beagle. Okay, I'm going to have a lot to say about Darwin each of the next 4 weeks, and I'll go more in depth into his biography. But for now, I want you to think about, read this as kind of a graduate student, a dissertation, so to speak, but which consists of a trip around the world. And these are his responses to the natural world. What I'd like you to write about briefly, and most importantly, be prepared to discuss, is find a place where there's something interesting about the natural world, life that he talks about, and find something interesting about his interaction with human beings, right? You'll see both some comments about Black slavery that he encounters in Brazil, also about the native peoples of South America. So find something about human beings and something about his interaction with life. And I'd like to have a kind of robust discussion tomorrow about the values and what is reflected in the way that Darwin is encountering this world on this trip. All right. I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow at 8 a.m. Write something. It can be brief, just kind of placeholder on those 2 questions, but especially be ready to talk about it in our discussion at 8:30. All right. Talk to you tomorrow.